In Chapter 8 of the book, we discuss particle systems. Since Unity 3.5 was released, Unity now contains a completely new particle system nicknamed Shuriken. The particle systems in 3.4 are still present and can be seen in the legacy category of component, effects, legacy particles. The old particle system was made up of 3 components: an emitter, an animator, and a renderer. Now we have just one system that contains many modules and can also have subsystems to it. Here is an example of the campfire we're going to make using Unity 3.5 to replace the content in the book. When looking at the book, in Chapter 8 you should stop at page 283, as this details using the previous particle system, and we want to use Shuriken, the new particle system, to make our campfire, and then control it via code later in the chapter. In this example we have flames, smoke, and sparks coming out of our fire. And this is exactly what we're going to make. At the end of page 282, you should see that you have a campfire model with a collider attached to it. This collider means that the player character, first-person controller, can bump into this at any moment in order to activate it, or check whether it's possible to activate it, depending on whether they are carrying the box of matches. We'll add this later in the chapter. First, let's create our particle system. Go to Game Object, Create Other, Particle System. We'll rename this Fire, and then make it a child object of the campfire. You'll see why this is important later, but for now, let's just drop it on. In the transform for this object, reset the position. Click on the cog and choose Reset Position. Next, let's raise it up slightly by placing 0.5 into the y-axis of transform position. The new particle system is a large component with many different smaller modules that control how it behaves or looks. This can also be opened as a larger editor view by clicking the Open Editor button. I've docked this window at the bottom next to my game view to give me more space to work. As we continue adding other subsystems, they will appear to the right of these systems, and you can add these by clicking the plus button. For now, we'll continue to work on the fire. For the duration, we'll place in 6 seconds. We'll make sure that it loops, and then we'll give it a starting lifetime for each particle of 3 seconds. We'll make the start speed much slower, a value of 1.2, so that the flames flow up naturally. Then we'll make the start size slightly higher, a value of 1.5. Next we'll move down to the emission value, expand it, and set the rate to 20. Then, under Shape, we'll ensure that Cone is selected and set the angle to something much narrower, a value of 5. When you have Shape selected like this, you can see the cone value as a visual gizmo inside the scene view. Next, we'll set the radius to something smaller, a value of 1.5. You can show and hide any of these modules at any time by simply clicking on the grey bar. I'm going to hide the 2 that we've just worked on, and go down to Color over Lifetime. Checking the box will enable this module, and I can then make use of this Color Gradient Editor to set up a color. Click on the Gradient Editor to expand it. I'm going to start by putting in a color block at about 10% along the bar at the bottom. Then I'm going to click the color block at the bottom to set its color, and I'm going to choose a value of red. Then I'm going to choose the existing alpha stop at the top and set the value down to 0. I'm going to place in another alpha stop above the second color stop that I placed in earlier and set the alpha back up so that it fades into red. Then further along, I'm going to set the value to orange by adding another color stop. I'm going to decrease the alpha for that by adding in another alpha stop, and then I'm going to set the alpha to 0 by the end, and the color to some kind of darker reddy grey kind of color. Then I'm going to change to size over lifetime and expand this. This is an example of using a Bezier curve to set the behavior of something. So if you simply click on the curve, then you'll get to look at what that curve looks like, and you can add in points along it as well. I'm going to add in a key at around about 0.2. You can see that value at the bottom of the graph. And I'm going to basically change its size over time. So the 0 to 1 value you're seeing at the bottom is the value of its lifetime from start to end. So I effectively want my flames to get slower, but I'm putting in a general curve to make it a bit more of an interesting behavior. Something like this. And that's my size over lifetime. Then I'm going to make it behave a bit more interestingly by adding rotation over lifetime. So I check the box, and instead of an actual angle, I'm going to use a curve. So if you click the arrow to the right of that, you can select curve. And the angular velocity for that, I'm going to use one of the presets at the bottom. And then I'm just going to make some changes to how it looks. So I basically just want yet another wavy line for that. Something like this. It's dropping the rotation down and then rotating it back so that they kind of wave as they move up. That's most of the setup there. The last thing I want to do is actually add a material to this. So at the moment it's using that kind of default particle look. And that's not what we want. So what I've done is to create two new materials. So the first material for flame, I've done create material, and I've named it flame. And I've set it to use the shader particles additive soft. Then I've dragged and dropped my flame texture, which is something that you've downloaded with the book assets. So if you look in book assets textures, you'll find flame. I'm also going to provide an updated flame material on the site, so look out for the download along with this video. So what you should see is a flame texture where you've dragged and dropped flame 2 on. It uses particles additive soft as the shader, and then what we're going to do with that is to apply it to the fire. So under renderer at the bottom, you simply need to drag and drop that flame material onto where it says material. And then we have something that looks like that. So now I can see that the flames towards the end of their lifetime are still really big. So what I'm going to do is go back to my curve for that, and then I'm just going to decrease them over time. And obviously the great thing about this new system is that you can pretty much infinitely play around with what things look like until you're happy with them. So I'm going to stick with something like that. Obviously I can play around with the colors as well if I want to. If I want to add in a yellow further on, I can do that. So just have a play around and keep working on that until you're happy with it. And that will do for my cartoony campfire. That's cool. And the next thing I want to do is add in the smoke. So I'm going to add yet another system in, and you can do this fairly easily by just clicking on the plus symbol to the right of the existing system in the particle effect window. And there's yet another one in there. So this is going to be for my smoke. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I'm on the translate tool, expand fire to see that I've now got another system. So basically when you make a new system, it adds it in as a child object. So I'm going to select that object and then just drag it up slightly, well, so that it's about halfway up the campfire. So we don't want the smoke to start in the middle of the flames. I'm going to do it towards the top of the actual campfire itself. Then what I'm going to do is put in a duration of 10. So we want this plume to last longer than the actual flames themselves. I'm going to set the start lifetime also to 10. My start speed to 1.5. Start size to a value of 2. Then I'm going to move down to emission. Set the value to 15. Then under shape, I still want it to be a cone, but again, I want it to be restricted. So I'll use a value of 5 and a value of 0.8. So if I just zoom out briefly there, you can see the kind of plume that I've got going upwards. Naturally, again, this is using the default particle look, so don't expect it to look like that once we've added the material. We're just looking at the behavior right now. So then I'm going to go to color over lifetime. I'm going to bring up my gradient editor yet again, and I basically want to go from a dark gray color, or maybe a mid-gray, for example, that's got an alpha value that's quite low so that it's fading in. And we also don't want anything to pop onto the screen, so usually when you're creating these kind of particles, you want to start with 0 alpha and then allow it to fade in. And then further along, we're going to have a darker grey and a much higher alpha value so people can actually see it. If you want to get rid of these stops at any point, you just drag them up and away. So if you're used to Photoshop, you will know that kind of workflow. And then the last stop as well, I'm going to make a similar grey, but allow it to fade out. So make the alpha at the end 0, and make one near to the end that's higher. So I'm going to spread those out so that it fades nicely. And then hopefully we should have something that looks like that. Obviously it's quite dark higher up, but like I say, once we add the material, it will look quite different. Cool. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is work on the size over lifetime. I'm going to make those increase as they go up. So if I check the box and expand that module, I'm just going to make the first point lower than the end point. Something like that. Then I'm going to change the rotation over lifetime. And again, I'm going to make use of a curve instead of using just an angle. So I'll choose curve by clicking the down arrow to the right. And yet again, I just want it to change over time. So I'm going to use that crazy preset and then just simply tone it down a little bit. Just so that things are kind of moving and waving as they go upwards. Finally, I'm going to go to the renderer and apply the material that I made earlier. So I'm using the same shader here, Particles Additive Soft, and I've dragged on the smoke material that you'll find in textures in book assets. So there's one called smoke. I've dragged that on. I'm then going to apply that material to my new system. So I'll drag smoke and I'll drop it onto the slot in the renderer next to material. So now you can see I've got that nice looking smoke texture going up. Cool. So I'm going to rename that system. Instead of Particle System 2, I want to call it Smoke, just for organization's sake. Now we're going to add the particle system for the sparks. So I'm going to click on the Create Particle System button again. And make sure that you're working on the one you intend to. So Particle System 2 is the one I'm after there. So you can see that smoke here is moved over to the right, keeping them in alphabetical order. So duration in this is something that I'm filling in a value of 5. That's cool. Keep that. We're going to be looping and pre-warming. And then we're going to set the start lifetime to a value of 3. In start speed, I'm going to make use of random between 2 curves. So start speed, I'm going to make somewhere between 4.5 and 5. So we want them mostly to be the same speed, but some of them to be slightly slower than others. That's the basic kind of thing that's happening here. Then for start size, we want it to be quite small. So I'm going to make use of that random between 2 curves yet again. For the size, we want it to be quite small. So I'm going to make use of those curves and drag that value right down. So we've got some fairly small particles going on now. I'm going to set it to a value of between 0 and 0.1. So remember, these are sparks, and we could have little embers drifting up using this method. So if you wanted to make another system and refollow those steps again to get to this point, then that's cool. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and carry on with the sparks for now. Next, I'm going to move down to Start Color, and I'm going to set that random between 2 colors. I've got white there, and I'm going to set this second one to some kind of orange color. Then I'm going to set my gravity modifier to a value of 1. So that means that these things actually have gravity, and you can see that they're actually spitting out kind of like we expect them to now, which is good. Then I'm going to go to emission, change from 10 to 30 so that we have more of them. In shape, I'm going to set the shape to a sphere and the radius to 0.05. They're basically spitting them out over a smaller scale right now. Next, I'm going to make use of color over lifetime. So in this, we're just going to control the alpha values. So towards the end of the lifetime, I want it to kind of fade out, but only quite close to the end. So I'm going to stick with white all the way through, because as for the color, what we're going to do is make use of color by speed. I'm going to check the box, open it up, and then use the gradient editor to go from a color of white to a color of orange. So they're kind of starting off light and then kind of cooling down as they get fired out from the fire. I'm then going to close those two to give myself some space, and I'm going to work on collision. So for collision, what you need to do is specify a transform for them to kind of land onto. What I can do is go to Game Object, Create Empty, and I can drop that onto the system manually. Then I can simply choose it, collision plane. And if I want to control where it is, I can move it around in the scene view. And you can see that it's previewing there. So I want to make sure that plane is as close as possible to the actual ground that I've got going on in my terrain. So the good thing about this is that I actually have a fairly flat part there. So as I move this around, go back to my system, I can see that it looks like it's where it's meant to be. So once I've specified the plane transform, so bear in mind this isn't an actual plane, this is just an empty game object, but it treats its axis as the actual plane area that these particles are going to bounce onto. I need to set some settings for the collision itself. So I'm going to dampen by 0.5 when they collide, so that when it hits they lose half of their velocity. Then for the bounce, I'm going to make it 0.75. So again, they kind of slow down and fade out, as you can see. I don't want them to lose lifetime, and I don't want to change the minimum speed. But what I do want to do is stretch the particles as they come out, because right now they kind of look like some kind of little dots. So what I'm going to do with that is to open up the renderer, and I'm going to make use of stretched billboard. I'm going to make use of speed scale. So I'm going to set that to 0.05, and I'm going to set the length scale to a value of 1. Then finally, what I want to do with this is to actually assign a material to it. So for this, there's a material that I'm going to provide as a download along with the new flame texture. And it's something that came from Unity Technologies as part of a example pack for Shuriken that you can download from their site. And what I'm going to do is make a new material. So I'm going to say create material. Again, I'm going to say this is going to be spark. So I'll go to shader, particles, additive soft, and this texture is called flare, and I'm going to drop that on. Then I'm going to go back to my particle system, back to the renderer, and drop on the spark. That pretty much completes our sparks coming out of our fire. The last thing I'm going to do is to rename that particle system sparks. And there we have it. That's our campfire. We have sparks coming out of it, and we have flames and smoke. So that's a kind of basic usage of Shuriken in order to get the campfire for the book. And what we're going to do now is just stop the simulation and then go back and ensure that the emission for these is disabled. So play on awake under each of the particle systems need to be unchecked. So what you can see there is that if I check the parent one, play on awake is disabled for all three. So make sure it's disabled because we want to re-enable this with a script later in the book. So now you can skip ahead to page 291. This is where we add audio. So complete that part and then work from page 291 to page 300. and then stop before the heading using loops and arrays for commands on multiple objects. Because the old particle system was made up of several different objects, we can see that if we look at the old 3.4 version, we had a fire system with the different components, a smoke system, and we didn't have sparks in that system at all. We had to use an array, so a collection or a list of objects, to gather them up and switch them on one at a time using a loop. Now, you should definitely read that part of the book, but don't carry out its instructions, because to enable this campfire, we simply want to make use of a much simpler line of code instead of gathering up different objects, because we're simply addressing the parent and telling it to play. So you can see we have the particle effect simulate is effectively the same as playing it, and we're going to do that via code. So if you work from 291 to 300 and stop before that heading I just mentioned, and then instead of the code that I'm telling you to use there, we're going to make use of the following. So the light fire function that you had before in the book, we're asking you to put in an array of different particle emitters and enable them. But the great thing about this is that we're actually sending the object that we bumped into. So if the thing is bumped into, we're looking at Campfire, so that's great. And we're saying campfire.getComponent in children. So in the book, we say get components with an S in children, and that allows us to gather an array of different emitters, but we just want to grab one system in a child object. So we look through the child objects, we find that system, and then we use the .play function to trigger all of them off at once. Because we're addressing the parent particle system, this is going to set light to all three systems at once and effectively start it playing. So what you can then do is pick back up on page 301 and pick up at the paragraph that starts, "Finally, let's re-enable the audio of the campfire too." And you're going to go through and start writing this line here. So that updates chapter 8 for the book. Thanks, and I hope you're enjoying it.